Hello and welcome to Inside Iraq. I'm Jassim Azzawi. It's been a week of intense consultations and negotiations in Ankara as Turkey considers its response to the recent cross-border attacks by Kurdish PKK rebels. Both the US and Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki called the PKK a terrorist organization. The Iraqi President Jalal Talbani, himself a Kurd, refuses to do likewise, prompting Turkish leaders to question the sincerity of Iraq's Kurds. Turkey's patience is running out fast. They want the president of the Kurdistan regional government, Masoud al-Barzani, to expel the PKK from northern Iraq or to allow the Turkish army to come in and crush them. If Barzani hesitates too much, he may ultimately find himself on the receiving end of Turkish fury, something the US is desperately trying to avoid. Huda Abdelhamid reports from northern Iraq.
Nobody knows better the meaning of a full-scale incursion than the border villagers. Over the past few months, they've been watching helplessly as Turkey continues its low-intensity shelling campaign on Iraqi territory. Hit-and-miss operations against PKK targets. Up there on the mountains is one of the many bases Turkey has along its border with Iraq. Now, the border in this area consists of this river just here behind me. Over the past few months, Turkey has started to build that road that leads straight from the mountains into northern Iraq.
We agreed that
the potential of another front in Iraq has pushed Iraq's leaders to label the PKK for the first time as a terrorist organization, and they vow to expel them.
Maliki would listen to the Kurds very seriously. I mean, he has to. I mean, the survival of his government is somehow dependent on the goodwill of the Kurds, Iraqi Kurds. So,
Kurdish leaders have been at odds with Baghdad and Turkey on how to deal with the PKK fighters based in the mountains of northern Iraq.
This is a political problem. It's not a military problem, and it will not be solved by military operations. If there is a political solution, of course, we believe that this will lead to positive results for the region.
The regional government warns that if Turkey's troops and tanks crossed into northern Iraq, they won't stay idle and watch. Kurdish troops have already been deployed to the border area, taking up defensive positions in case of what they perceive as a Turkish aggression against Iraqi Kurds. Turkey is the biggest investor here. There are more than 1,000 companies operating in the Kurdish region, and many are eager to protect this economic boom. Many also perceive the PKK as a problem, which is not theirs.
The PKK should go and wage their fight inside Turkey.
But an invasion could ignite a new wave of Kurdish nationalism that would sweep from Iraq into Turkey. For Inside Iraq, Huda Abdelhamid, along the Iraqi-Turkish border.
Before we start the discussion with our main three panelists, I am joined from Ankara by our reporter, Mike Hanna. Mike, the spokesman for the Iraqi Defense Ministry, Mohammed al-Askari, just told Al Jazeera that progress has been made in Ankara, most likely in reference to closing the PKK offices and perhaps even issuing some arrest warrants against them. Will that satisfy Ankara? Is war inevitable?
War is not inevitable, but it's unlikely that what has been announced so far from the Iraqi side will satisfy the Turkish government. They are looking for more, much more than that. One must remember over a long period of time, they have received numerous assurances, guarantees that steps will be taken by the Baghdad government to assist them in their struggle against the PKK. This, in the Turkish point of view, has not borne any fruit. They were waiting to hear in the course of the day something tangible, something concrete, something that is actually action rather than just words. Whether they've got that yet, we're not quite sure. But one must understand as well that this is part of a process. Two things. Firstly, that the Turkish army have continued ongoing operations across that border against PKK targets. There have been airstrikes, there have been artillery barrages, there have even been a limited ground incursion. But these are all limited actions, nothing like that massive invasion that the international community so fears could destabilize the north of Iraq. To understand the second point, these talks today are part of an ongoing process, an accelerated process in the light of the crisis at the moment, but it's part of an ongoing process. No decisions are likely to be taken in the next few days. There is a Neighbours of Iraq conference taking place in Istanbul next week, Before that conference, the Turkish Prime Minister is likely to be speaking to the US Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice. After that conference, he is going to go and speak to the US President George W. Bush in Washington. These are all parts of the process. Once that process is fully exhausted, then there will be a decision from the Turkish government. And what the Turkish government has made very clear is that it's willing to listen to Baghdad, it is willing to listen to the United States. It looks to get support from the United States, as it gave United States support in Afghanistan, for example. It looks to get support from Baghdad. But if this support is not forthcoming, the Turkish government will reserve its right to take unilateral action. But that decision will not be taken until these conferences, these talks have been held in the week to come.
Mike Hanna from Ankara, thank you for sharing that assessment with us. I'm joined from Baghdad by our reporter, James Bays. James, the Turks are looking at this delegation in Ankara as the last chance to avert full-scale war. To what extent the Iraqi Prime Minister al-Maliki is cognizant of the risk, and to what extent the different position taken by the Kurdistan regional government hampering his efforts?
Well, I think Nouri al-Maliki knows how serious the situation is. He sat down a few days ago with the Turkish foreign minister, and I think once the cameras left the room, there was a very frank exchange of views. He knows that there's 100,000 troops about on the Turkish border, belonging to the second biggest army in NATO. So I think he's well aware of the threat. The question is his room for manoeuvre and what he can do about all of this, because, as you know, that part of Iraq, northern Iraq, Iraqi Kurdistan, has been semi-autonomous for years. The troops on the ground there, the Iraqi troops, may be part of the Iraqi security forces nominally, but they are Kurdish Peshmerga, and their main loyalty is to their Kurdish political leaders. What's more, it would be difficult for Prime Minister Maliki to confront those leaders if he wanted to push them in a particular direction, because they are key elements of his coalition running the country here from Baghdad.
James Bays from Baghdad, thank you very much. And now I am joined from Ankara by Onur Oyman, Deputy Leader of the Turkish Republican Party, and from Baghdad by Iraqi Minister of Industry Fawzi al-Hariri, and from Washington by David Foley, Press Spokesman and Deputy Director of Public Affairs at the U.S. State Department. Gentlemen, welcome to Inside Iraq. Mr. Onur Oyman, let me start with you. The reports from Ankara is talking about certain progress being made. Most likely it is going to involve closing the PKK offices. Will that be enough? What is it exactly Ankara wants from Baghdad?
Well, certainly not. In the past, Baghdad government has repeatedly said that they decided to close PKK offices. But in fact, now they are repeating what they have said previously. The problem is that the Iraqi government apparently doesn't have enough means, to say the least, to combat terrorists on the Iraqi territory near Turkish border. So Iraqi government is under the Iraqi constitution, Article 140, is in charge of combating terrorism on Iraqi territory. But in fact, nobody has organized any operation so far against PKK. Not a single terrorist is arrested and delivered to Turkey so far. Therefore, we don't believe that such palliative measures will help us to finish with this terrorist group in northern Iraq.
And yet, David, how do you explain that your main ally in Iraq, mainly the Kurds, in the form of the President Jalal Talbani, as well as the President of the Kurdistan Regional Government, Mr. Masoud al-Barzani, they refuse to call the PKK a terrorist organization, which goes to the very heart of the current issue?
I need to make clear that the United States supports the Turkish government in their efforts to defend Turkey against terrorism. We have urged restraint on the Turkish government, and in particular, we have recommended against any actions that would lead to instability. And in particular, we have made clear that we are against cross-border operations. However, it is clear that we are for the call by Prime Minister al-Maliki to close the PKK offices, but what we want to see now is concrete actions.
Closing the offices is no longer the end game for Ankara. They want the leaders to be also handed over to Ankara. Is Baghdad capable of doing that?
I think it's fair to say that Iraq and the government of Iraq and that of the regional government of the KRG had been at the forefront of fighting terrorism.
The split, the dichotomy between what Nouri al-Maliki says and what Jalal Talbani and Masoud says couldn't be sharper. Ask you again, why is it the president of Iraq and the president of the KRG refuse to call the PKK a terrorist organization, which is exactly what it is?
You see, the issue really is not just the PKK. This is a group of military individuals that the Barzani party for years fought against side by side of the Turkish forces. Jassim, you remember in the 90s, there was a very strong campaign, military campaign, to finish their presence in Iraq. And that is one of the reasons why they are where they are at the moment.
There is an offer on the table, Mr. Oyman, by the Americans, and that is the defense minister of the United States said, perhaps we can take a joint military action against the PKK rebels once we get good intelligence from the ground. Will that something Turkey and Ankara and Tayyip Recep Erdogan entertain?
This information was lately denied. The problem is that American troops are in Iraq in the last 4 years. They have approximately 150,000 troops, but so far Americans have not engaged to any operation. We are not willing to hear any more promises. We are willing to see concrete actions.
If Iraq does not do anything and if the US does not take a joint military action, can you see that Turkey has no alternative but do it alone?
This is a political problem, not a military problem. It's a political problem that you can see is being addressed in a very vigorous way through diplomacy, through dialogue, through intensive meetings and communications between senior leaders around the world who are doing their very best to ensure that we do see an end to this PKK threat of terrorism. We have called on the Turkish authorities to resist any idea of going into a cross-border operation. So far, we have seen a commitment by all the sides to pursue a political solution to this, and we believe those efforts need to continue.
We'll take a short break now. We'll continue our discussion after the break. Stay with us.
If a neighbouring country is providing a safe haven for terrorism, we have rights under international law, and we will use those rights. Recep Erdogan, Turkish Prime Minister.